Pop quiz. What did most samurai do during Japan's Edo period? If you answered fought epic battles or trained with swords all day, you're wrong. And you're not alone. Pretty much everyone gets this wrong. Here's the reality. During the Edo period, which lasted 265 years, most samurai never fought in a single battle. Not one. In fact, when researchers analyzed samurai diaries from 1750 to 1800, they found that over 90% of samurai never drew their swords in anger even once during their entire lives. So what were they actually doing? Paperwork. Mountains of paperwork. Today, we're separating myth from reality. We're looking at what samurai daily life actually looked like during the Edo period. And I'm warning you now, the truth is way less exciting than the movies, but way more interesting than you'd think. Because here's the thing, the samurai didn't fall because they were defeated in battle. They fell because peacetime made them obsolete, and they couldn't adapt. Let's start with the basics. Before we dive into daily life, you need to understand what the Edo period actually was. Because without this context, nothing else makes sense. The Edo period ran from 1603 to 1868. That's 265 years of Japanese history. To put that in perspective, that's longer than the United States has existed. It started when Tokugawa Ieyasu won the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 and became shogun 3 years later. He established his government in Edo, which we now call Tokyo. And here's the critical part. He brought peace to Japan. Not temporary peace. Not fragile peace. Rock solid, nobody's fighting anybody peace that lasted for over 2.5 centuries. Now you might think, great, peace is good, right? And sure, for the average farmer or merchant, peace was fantastic. No armies trampling your crops. No soldiers burning your village. No being drafted to fight in someone else's war. But for the samurai, peace was a disaster. Think about it. The samurai class defined themselves as warriors. That was their entire identity, their reason for existing. The thing that separated them from everyone else and justified their privileged position in society. And suddenly, there were no wars to fight. During the previous era, the Sengoku period, or Warring States period, Japan had been in constant conflict for over a century. Samurai earned their positions through military skill. They proved their worth on the battlefield. They lived as actual warriors. But the Edo period changed everything. Let's look at the numbers. In 1600, at the start of the Tokugawa regime, there were approximately 400,000 samurai in Japan. That's about 2 of the total population. These warriors and their families made up the entire ruling class. By 1700, a century into the Edo period, there were still about 400,000 samurai. Same number. But here's the thing. None of them had fought in a war. Not their fathers. Not their grandfathers. Some families hadn't seen real combat in 4 or 5 generations. You had an entire class of warriors who had never been to war. So what did they do instead? They became bureaucrats. The Tokugawa shogunate needed to administer a country of about 30 million people. They needed tax collectors, record keepers, magistrates, administrators, inspectors, accountants, and clerks. And the samurai, with their education, their literacy, and their enforced loyalty, were perfect for these roles. So the warrior class became the administrative class. Swords were still required as status symbols, but the most important tool for most samurai became the writing brush. This is the world we're exploring today. A world where samurai filed reports instead of fighting battles. Where they calculated taxes instead of commanding troops. Where they died of boredom instead of dying in glory. Let's look at what that actually meant. If you want to understand samurai daily life, you need to understand how they got paid. Because the stipend system shaped everything about their existence. Here's how it worked. Samurai didn't own businesses. They didn't farm land themselves. They didn't earn money through trade. All of that was beneath their social status. Instead, they received stipends, fixed payments from their lord, measured in units called koku. Now, what's a koku? Glad you asked, because this is important. One koku was defined as the amount of rice needed to feed one person for 1 year. In practical terms, that's about 150 kilograms, or roughly 330 pounds of rice. So when we say a samurai received a stipend of 200 koku, we're saying he received enough rice to theoretically feed 200 people for a year. Sounds pretty good, right? Let's look at the actual numbers. Take a look at this breakdown. I'm going to show you the different levels of samurai stipends during the Edo period. At the very top, you had the daimyo, the great lords. These guys received 10,000 koku or more per year. Some of the most powerful daimyo had stipends exceeding 500,000 koku. They were incredibly wealthy by any standard. High-ranking samurai, the ones serving directly under the daimyo in important positions, might receive 500 to 1,000 koku annually. This was enough to live very comfortably, maintain a large household, and save money. Mid-ranking samurai, your typical samurai bureaucrat working in domain administration, received between 100 and 300 koku per year. This sounds decent, and it was enough to survive, but it wasn't luxurious. Low-ranking samurai, the ones doing basic administrative work or serving as guards, received 30 to 100 koku annually. This is where things start getting tight. And then you had the Ishigaru, the foot soldiers, who received as little as 3 to 10 koku per year. These guys were technically samurai class, but they were barely scraping by. Now here's the critical thing to understand. These stipends were paid in rice. Actual rice. Twice a year you'd receive your rice shipment and that was your income. But you can't pay rent in rice. You can't buy clothes in rice. You can't eat only rice for an entire year. So samurai had to convert their rice to money. This created several problems. First, rice prices fluctuated. A lot. Depending on the harvest, the price of rice could vary by 30 or 40% year to year. So your actual income was unpredictable even though your stipend stayed the same. Second, there was inflation. Over the course of the Edo period, prices gradually increased for most goods. But stipends stayed fixed. If your family had received 200 koku for 3 generations, you were still receiving 200 koku. But that 200 koku bought less and less as time went on. Third, there were taxes and fees. Even though samurai didn't pay regular taxes the way commoners did, they had various fees and obligations that reduced their actual take-home amount. Let me give you a concrete example. Let's say you're a mid-ranking samurai in 1750 with a stipend of 150 koku. That's your household's entire income for the year. First, you have to convert that rice to money. In 1750, 1 koku of rice sold for about 1 ryo of silver. So your 150 koku converts to roughly 150 ryo. But wait, you don't get all 150 koku. About 10 goes to storage fees and the merchants who handle the conversion. So you're down to 135 ryo in actual cash. Now let's look at your expenses. You need to maintain a home appropriate to your status. That's about 20 ryo per year. You need to feed your family. Let's say you have a wife and 2 children. Even with rice from your stipend, other food costs about 40 ryo per year. You need clothing appropriate to your rank. Samurai were required to dress in specific ways, and quality clothing wasn't cheap. That's another 15 ryo annually. You're required to maintain your swords and armor, even though you'll probably never use them. That's 10 ryo per year for upkeep and storage. You need to pay for your children's education. Even basic tutoring costs about 8 ryo per year. You're expected to give gifts during certain festivals and to your superiors. That's another 10 ryo. You need household items, medicine, occasional travel, and a dozen other miscellaneous expenses. Another 20 ryo. Add it all up. 20 plus 40 plus 15 plus 10 plus 8 plus 10 plus 20 is equal to 123 ryo. You have 135 ryo in income and 123 ryo in basic expenses. That leaves you with 12 ryo per year in discretionary income. 1 ryo per month. And remember, this is a mid-ranking samurai. This is someone who's relatively well off within the class. Low-ranking samurai, the ones receiving 30 to 50 koku, they were going into debt. Many of them took illegal side jobs just to feed their families. We're talking about members of the ruling class making umbrellas and toothpicks in secret because they couldn't survive on their stipends. Here's what's fascinating. By the late Edo period, many merchants were wealthier than samurai, sometimes much wealthier. But the merchants were lower class. They had money but no status. The samurai had status but no money. This created an absurd situation where poor samurai would borrow money from wealthy merchants, then treat those same merchants as social inferiors. The merchant would bow to the samurai while thinking, "I own your debt, you broke aristocrat." The stipend system was supposed to provide financial security to the samurai class. Instead, it locked them into poverty they couldn't escape. They couldn't change careers because of class restrictions. They couldn't engage in commerce because it was beneath them. They couldn't farm because that was a different class's job. All they could do was their bureaucratic duties and hope their stipend stretched far enough. Speaking of those bureaucratic duties, let's talk about what samurai actually did all day. Let's walk through a typical day for a samurai during the Edo period. I'm going to use a specific example to make this concrete. Meet Tanaka Yoshihiro. He's a mid-ranking samurai in the city of Edo, serving in the magistrate's office. He's 35 years old, married with 2 children, and receives a stipend of 180 koku per year. He's not wealthy, not poor, just average for his class. It's a Tuesday in the spring of 1750. Let's follow him through his day. 5 a.m. Tanaka wakes up in his modest home. By modest, I mean genuinely modest. His house has 3 rooms, a sleeping area, a living area, and a small study. His entire family shares this space. There's no separate kitchen, that's outside in a shared area. He performs his morning ablutions. Cold water. No hot shower. Then he changes from his sleeping clothes into a simple cotton kimono. Not the fancy silk ones you see in movies. Most samurai wore cotton for everyday life. 5:30 a.m. Morning exercises. This is one area where the warrior tradition continues. Tanaka practices basic sword movements and does stretching exercises. Not because he expects to fight anyone, but because it's part of the samurai code and it helps him maintain dignity and discipline. 6 a.m. Breakfast. Rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables. Maybe some dried fish if the family budget allows this month. His wife and children eat after he finishes. That's the tradition. 6:45 a.m. Tanaka changes into his formal work attire. This is more elaborate. A hakama, the pleated pants, a formal kimono, and his 2 swords. The swords are required by law. He must wear them whenever he leaves the house. He hasn't drawn either sword in anger in his entire life. 7 a.m. He walks to the magistrate's office where he works. It's about a 15-minute walk through Edo streets. He maintains perfect posture because that's expected. Other samurai bow to him based on his rank. He bows back based on theirs. There's a whole hierarchy of bowing angles that everyone has memorized. 7:30 a.m. He arrives at work and signs in. Yes, sign in. There's a record book where all samurai employees record their arrival time. Bureaucracy. 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. Morning work shift. Let me tell you exactly what Tanaka does, because this is where the reality gets really interesting. His primary responsibility is tax administration. Specifically, he reviews and processes tax records from farming villages in the district his office oversees. Today, he's working on the autumn rice tax submissions from 3 villages. He has physical scrolls delivered to him, reports submitted by village headmen documenting the rice harvest, the calculated tax owed, and the payment schedule. His job is to verify these reports. Are the numbers accurate? Did the village headman use the correct calculation formula? Were there any special circumstances, flood, drought, fire, that would justify a tax reduction? He checks each report against previous year's records. If Village A reported a harvest of 500 koku this year, but has averaged 800 koku for the past 5 years, that's suspicious. Either there was a genuine crop failure, or someone's lying to reduce taxes. He takes notes in beautiful calligraphy. Every character must be perfect because these records are official documents. Sloppy handwriting would dishonor both him and his office. If he finds discrepancies, he writes formal inquiries that will be sent back to the village headman. These must be worded carefully, polite but firm, detailed but not accusatory. This is what he does. For 4 hours. Reviewing tax documents and writing reports. Around 10 a.m., there's a brief break. Tea is served. Tanaka and his colleagues sit in formal seiza position and drink tea while discussing work. This isn't a casual break. It's still governed by strict etiquette. Back to work. More tax records. More calligraphy. More checking numbers against previous years. 12 p.m. Lunch break. Tanaka eats a simple meal brought from home. Rice balls, maybe some vegetables. He eats with his colleagues, still maintaining formal posture and speech. 12:30 p.m. An unexpected meeting. A dispute has arisen between 2 merchants in the district. Both are requesting mediation from the magistrate's office. Tanaka is assigned to handle the preliminary investigation. He must interview both merchants, review their claims, examine any documents or evidence, and prepare a report for the senior magistrate who will actually make the ruling. The dispute is about a damaged shipment of cloth. Merchant A claims Merchant B's goods were improperly packaged, causing damage during transport. Merchant B claims Merchant A's cart drivers handled the goods roughly. Tanaka spends 2 hours listening to both sides, examining the damaged cloth, reviewing the transport contract, and taking meticulous notes. This is samurai work in the Edo period, mediating merchant disputes and examining damaged fabric. 3 p.m., back to tax records. He still has one village's submission to review before the day ends. For 30 p.m., a senior official enters and announces there will be a ceremony next week commemorating the shogun's deceased father. All samurai of certain ranks must attend. This means Tanaka needs to make sure his formal ceremonial clothes are clean and properly maintained. This means expense. Ceremonies always mean expense. 5 p.m., workday ends. Tanaka signs out in the record book and heads home. 5:30 p.m., he arrives home and changes into more comfortable clothes. His wife has prepared dinner. The family eats together, though Tanaka eats first as head of household. 6:30 p.m., evening study time. This is important. Samurai were expected to continue their education throughout their lives. Tonight, Tanaka is copying sections from a Confucian text. His domain has recently circulated new philosophical writings, and all samurai are expected to read and understand them. He's also practicing his calligraphy. The better his handwriting, the better his chances for promotion to a higher administrative position with a larger stipend. 8 p.m., brief sword practice. Just basic forms and movements. 15 minutes of going through the motions of techniques he'll never use in real combat. 8:30 p.m., personal time. Tanaka might read or talk with his wife or review the household budget. Sometimes he works on a side project. He's learning to repair umbrellas, though he'd never admit this to his colleagues. The extra money would help. 9 p.m., bed. He needs to be up at 5 a.m. again tomorrow to do it all over. This is daily life. This is what being a samurai actually meant in the Edo period. No epic battles. No dramatic sword fights. Just paperwork, meetings, tax records, ceremony, and trying to make your stipend stretch far enough to cover expenses. 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, for your entire adult life. Let me show you a breakdown of how Tanaka spends his time over a typical week. Administrative work, reviewing records and writing reports, 32 hours. Meetings and official duties, 6 hours. Ceremonial activities, 2 hours. Martial training, 5 hours. Study and self-cultivation, 7 hours. Personal time, 18 hours. Sleep, 56 hours. Look at that. Out of a 168-hour week, Tanaka spends 32 hours on administrative paperwork and only 5 hours on anything related to martial skills. This is the reality that myths ignore. Let's directly compare the myths to the reality. I'm going to go through the most common misconceptions about samurai and show you what historical records actually tell us. Myth number 1. Samurai were constantly training and fighting. Reality. During the Edo period, most samurai spent 1 to 2 hours per day on martial training, and it was largely ceremonial. A study of samurai diaries from 1700 to 1800 showed that the average samurai spent 6 to 8 hours daily on administrative work and less than 2 hours on martial practice. Furthermore, the martial practice wasn't realistic combat training. It was kata, formalized movements and techniques practiced solo or with partners following scripts. It was more like dance than actual fighting. Why? Because there was no one to fight. There were no wars. There were no battles. Sword fighting became a cultural art form rather than a practical skill. Myth number 2. All samurai were wealthy. Reality. Economic records from the Edo period show that approximately 70 of samurai families lived on stipends of less than 100 koku per year. After conversion to cash and basic expenses, many had less than 10 ryo in discretionary income annually. Multiple sources document samurai taking secret side jobs to make ends meet. They made umbrellas, lanterns, toothpicks, and fans. They tutored merchant children. They did piecework from home. All of this was technically illegal and shameful, but necessary for survival. There are recorded cases of samurai families selling their swords and armor, their symbols of warrior status, just to buy food. Myth number 3. Bushido was an ancient warrior code followed for centuries. Reality. The formalized Bushido code that most people know was largely created during the Edo period itself. The most famous Bushido text, Hagakure, was written in 1716 by a samurai who had never seen combat. Think about that. The definitive samurai code of honor was written by someone romanticizing a warrior past he'd never experienced, during a time of complete peace. Earlier samurai from the Sengoku period followed different codes, and those codes were much more practical and much less romanticized. The idealized Bushido was nostalgia for a war-fighting era, created by bureaucrats who wished they were warriors. Myth number 4. Samurai were master swordsmen. Reality. By the late Edo period, many samurai couldn't actually use their swords effectively. They trained in kata and forms, but had zero experience with real combat application. When the Meiji Restoration came and some samurai actually did fight, observers noted that many were terrible swordsmen despite decades of training. The skills they'd practiced were theatrical, not practical. There are accounts of samurai who couldn't even properly draw their swords in emergency situations because they'd literally never done it outside of slow, ceremonial practice. Myth number 5. Samurai could use their swords whenever they felt disrespected. Reality. The Tokugawa shogunate had strict regulations about when swords could be drawn. Unauthorized drawing of weapons was a serious offense that could result in severe punishment, including seppuku, ritual suicide, or execution. The famous right to cut down commoners, kirasut gomen, was heavily restricted and required extensive documentation and justification. You couldn't just kill someone for being rude. You'd have to file reports, undergo investigation, and potentially face punishment yourself if the killing was deemed unjustified. Most samurai went their entire lives without drawing their swords against another person. Myth number 6. Samurai dedicated their lives to martial arts and military strategy. Reality. Educational records show that by the mid-Edo period, samurai education focused heavily on Confucian classics, calligraphy, mathematics, and administration. Martial arts were included, but were a small part of the curriculum. A samurai was more likely to study accounting than strategy, more likely to practice calligraphy than swordsmanship, and more likely to read poetry than military texts. The skills that actually helped your career were administrative skills, not martial skills. A samurai who could beautifully copy official documents had better promotion prospects than one who was skilled with a sword. Myth number 7. Samurai lived by a strict honor code that prevented any dishonorable behavior. Reality. Historical records show plenty of samurai behaving dishonorably by their own standards. They went into debt and avoided creditors. They took bribes. They falsified records. They engaged in forbidden commerce. They abandoned their duties. The gap between the idealized code and actual behavior was enormous. Yes, there were consequences if you got caught, but samurai were humans who compromised their values when necessary, just like everyone else. The romanticized image of the perfectly honorable samurai who'd rather die than break the code is mostly fiction. Real samurai were much more pragmatic. I could keep going, but you get the idea. Almost everything popular culture tells us about samurai is either exaggerated or completely wrong. The reality was much more mundane, much more bureaucratic, and honestly much more interesting than the myth. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough: the psychological toll of being a samurai during the Edo period. Imagine this scenario. You're born into the samurai class. From childhood, you're taught that you're special. You're a warrior. You're part of the elite. You're descended from men who fought battles and made history. You study martial arts. You learn sword techniques. You memorize military strategies. You're taught codes of honor and warrior virtues. And then you grow up and realize you're going to spend your entire life doing paperwork in an office. There are no wars to fight. There are no battles to win. There's no chance to prove yourself as a warrior. You're going to review tax records and mediate merchant disputes until you die. How do you think that feels? Samurai writings from the Edo period are full of expressions of frustration and melancholy. They write about feeling useless. They romanticize the past and wish they'd been born in an earlier era when warriors were actually needed. Some quotes from actual samurai diaries and letters. I practice sword techniques daily, knowing I will never use them. It feels like preparing for a play that will never be performed. My stipend barely feeds my family, yet I cannot engage in commerce without shaming my ancestors. I am trapped between poverty and pride. I watch merchants grow wealthy while I grow old filing reports. Their lives have purpose. Mine has only duty. This sense of purposelessness led to interesting developments. Some samurai threw themselves into artistic pursuits. They became poets, painters, or masters of tea ceremony. If they couldn't be warriors, at least they could be cultured. Others became obsessed with perfecting ceremonial details. If their martial skills were useless, at least they could perform ceremonies flawlessly. Some turned to philosophy and religion, seeking meaning beyond their administrative duties. And some just went through the motions, collecting their stipends, doing their jobs, and quietly dying of boredom. There was also the pressure of maintaining appearances. You might be broke, but you had to look prosperous. You had to dress appropriately, maintain a suitable home, give proper gifts, and attend all required ceremonies. This created enormous stress. You're worried about money constantly, but you can't show it. You're struggling to survive, but you have to act like everything's fine. There are documented cases of samurai families going hungry to save money for required gifts or ceremonial expenses. The appearance of propriety mattered more than actual well-being. The suicide rate among samurai during the Edo period was notably high, especially among lower-ranking samurai. While seppuku, ritual suicide, was supposed to be an honorable response to specific failures, Many samurai killed themselves simply because they saw no way out of their situation. They couldn't change careers. They couldn't pursue wealth. They couldn't escape their class. They were trapped in a system that provided just enough support to survive but not enough to thrive. The irony is sharp. The samurai class was created to fight. Fighting was their entire reason for existing. And then peace broke out and wouldn't go away. They became obsolete but couldn't admit it. Their identity was built on being warriors, but their reality was being bureaucrats. This identity crisis defined the late Edo period samurai experience. So what can we learn from all this? Why does understanding the reality of samurai daily life matter? First, it's a perfect example of how institutions can outlive their purpose. The samurai class was created to fight wars. When the wars ended, the class should have evolved or dissolved. Instead, it clung to existence for 250 more years, becoming increasingly dysfunctional. Second, it shows the problems with rigid social hierarchies. The samurai couldn't adapt because the class system wouldn't let them. They were locked into roles that no longer made sense. Talented people were wasted doing makework while opportunities in commerce and other fields were forbidden to them. Third, it demonstrates how myths replace reality. The Edo period samurai themselves created romanticized versions of the warrior past because the present was disappointing. They invented the idealized Bushido code because actual samurai life didn't live up to the warrior image. We still believe those myths today. We watch movies about noble samurai following ancient codes, when the historical reality was frustrated bureaucrats doing paperwork and struggling financially. Fourth, it's a reminder that economic systems matter. The stipend system seemed logical. Provide fixed income to a ruling class so they can focus on governance instead of wealth accumulation. But fixed incomes plus inflation equals poverty. The system trapped samurai in gradually increasing economic hardship. And finally, it shows the human cost of being unable to change. Many samurai knew the system wasn't working. They could see merchants becoming wealthier. They could see that their skills were obsolete. But they couldn't change because that would mean abandoning their identity, betraying their ancestors, and admitting the class system was wrong. So they endured. They maintained appearances. They did their jobs. They collected their inadequate stipends. And they pretended everything was fine. When the Meiji Restoration finally came in 1868 and abolished the samurai class entirely, it was almost a relief for many. The system had been dying slowly for decades. The Restoration just made it official. So there it is. The reality of samurai daily life during the Edo period. Not constant training and epic battles. Paperwork and budgets. Not wealthy nobility living in luxury. Struggling bureaucrats barely making ends meet. Not ancient warrior codes followed faithfully. Romanticized nostalgia for a past that never quite existed. Not master warriors ready to fight at any moment. Office workers carrying swords they'd never use. The truth is so different from the myth that it's almost funny. Almost. Except behind the statistics and the daily schedules were real people living frustrating, restricted lives. They were stuck in a system that didn't work, performing roles that didn't matter, maintaining appearances they couldn't afford, and pretending to be warriors when they were really administrators. And yet, there's something admirable about their perseverance. They maintained their dignity. They performed their duties. They upheld their standards even when it was economically irrational. They chose honor over comfort, even when honor meant poverty. The samurai may not have been the warriors we imagine, but their reality is more complex and more human than the myth. Next time you watch a samurai movie or anime, remember this: the real samurai were probably thinking about their tax records and worrying about whether their stipend would cover next month's expenses. Not as exciting as a sword fight, but a lot more relatable. Thanks for watching. If this changed how you think about samurai, leave a comment. What surprised you most? Did you know about the stipend system? Had you heard about their bureaucratic roles? And if you want more myth-busting history with detailed analysis and actual data, subscribe. We're going to keep exploring the gap between historical reality and popular myths, because the truth is always more interesting than the legend, even when the truth involves a lot more paperwork. See you next time.